Actually, my name's Kip. I'm going to be the voice in the background here, and I just wanted to tell you a little bit about Dr. Miller. James has been a longtime participant here at the symposium, and over the last several years, he's kind of focused many of his talks on the beginnings, the history, and the growth of racing here in Watkins Glen. Each year, he finds an interesting new avenue to wander down, and we're sure this year is going to be no different. So, I guess for a second time, let me introduce James Miller to you.
Thank you, Kip. Thank you, Chris. So, new location, but familiar, happy places. Glad to see everyone again. So I have to learn to use a new control. So just forgive me. I do this while not dropping it. The British historian Richard Evans says that history is an argument without end. That's because history is not the past. It's an attempt to construct a version out of fragmentary evidence using methods, historiography, that are themselves open to dispute. Ironically, when some aspect of history does reach a degree of consensus, the danger is that it will harden into mythology, a larger-than-life imaginary that comes to substitute for genuine knowledge about the past. Today I'd like to explore and maybe challenge a myth called the Watkins Glen effect. I understand this to have two meanings. One is strong and the other weak. The stronger and potentially more important is that early road circuits like Bridgehampton, Elkhart Lake, and Lime Rock imitated the Watkins Glen model, implicitly following its lead in organization, track design, commercial sponsorship, and so on. By this understanding, the Glen is the prototype from which American road racing sprang and over time developed. Historically, this would be a powerful claim. The second, weaker meaning is straightforward, that racing here enriched upstate New York. And by so doing, Watkins demonstrated that motorsport in general could evolve into successful sport tourism. Now, that might excite chambers of commerce, but to me it feels like a historical footnote. Watkins' premier place in the history of American motorsport is undisputed. The first post-war road race was held here in 1948. Several years later, a permanent track was constructed, and most significantly, from 1961, it became the home of the U.S. Formula One Grand Prix for 20 years, an accomplishment that has yet to be duplicated. Any so-called effect would just be an embellishment on these admirable facts. Determining any effect is difficult. What evidence would reveal such a thing, or during how long a period of time do you look for it? The biggest challenge is context. How do you tease out one influence on road racing from another? For example, American road racing did not originate in 1948. A direct line can be drawn from Watkins and the pre-war Automobile Racing Club of America, ARCA. Drivers involved at the Glen in 1948, like Briggs Cunningham, the Collier brothers, George Weaver, had all raced through the streets and roads of Montauk and Alexandria Bay during the 30s. ARCA even organized one of the last events at the 1939-40 New York World's Fair, a race through the fairgrounds. And by the way, it was won by Frank Griswold, who also won the first two Watkins Glen races in 1948. And you'll see that he's celebrated on the cover of our program. And of course, long before ARCA, starting in 1904, the Vanderbilt Cup raced for several years on the public roads of Long Island, which is said to have inspired the young Cameron Argetsinger. So maybe Watkins Glen itself can be understood as a kind of effect of others' activity. both earlier and contemporaneous. To put that differently, maybe it's more fruitful to think in terms of historical continuity and get fixated on a supposed origin point, a source from which all else came. Nevertheless, the question on the floor today is, did the Glen act as a kind of prototype for the development of American road racing after the war? To answer this question, I selected 3 tracks that are 1950s peers and compared them on 4 dimensions. The aim is to seek indications of influence from the Glen to the others. Now, racing mostly began only a few years after conditions of total war. Yet, in less than a decade, there were 4 new permanent dedicated road tracks, 3 of which were near neighbors of the Glen. And as we'll see, their development shared identifiable attributes. Now, the tracks to be compared are our baseline and nearby One Island, the Great Midwest, and even closer, Lime Rock. Now, it shouldn't be surprising that organizations as specialized as racetracks would have very similar origin stories. We reminded ourselves about the models offered by 1930s predecessors. And there were still earlier influences. Europeans raced bikes and cars on public roads in the late 19th century. And more directly, World War II engendered military experience with high technology and hierarchical forms of organization. And those carried over into post-war civilian life in the form of a corporation, which employed men who raced. Sports were beginning their transformation from family ownership and local identity to intensely commercialized global media spectacles. This was the common context for our 4 early tracks. Each of these tracks' origins involved variations on 4 common features. The first you see has to do with geography. And the second, importantly, with grassroots local interest. And then there's a category of actors we talked about last year, people outside these communities with an interest in racing. And finally, crucially, how local people felt about having cars racing through their streets and roads, both as an idea and an actuality. Now, before we move to the detailed work of comparing the tracks according to the 4 aspects of their development, I want to reveal my finding regarding the effect so that you can weigh the evidence and assess the logic of the comparison as we go along. And by the way, at the end of the talk, I promise to subvert my own finding. My conclusion regarding the Watkins Glen effect is a Scotch verdict. Sorry. Chris, what number is this?
Doesn't say what number. Oh, it's 9.
Oh, I'm ahead of myself. Excuse me, I would do this. Oh, I feel embarrassed. Well, I'll proceed. So my finding regarding the Watkins Glen effect is a Scotch verdict, not proven. Now, there are particularities that resulted in different outcomes for the circuits, but overall, all 4 tracks developed in similar, nearly identical fashion. It may be that common circumstances simply led them down the same path, almost inevitably. I'm content to say that the fates of Bridgehampton, Road America, and Line Rock were overdetermined, not by the influence of Watkins Glen, but by the shared circumstances that are summed up in what we call the post-war era. I could find no evidence in the available record that reveals the other three tracks attempting to mimic the Glen. But that conclusion is hobbled by methodological constraints. I read quite a bit of mostly published secondary material, but I did not travel to the Bridgehampton Museum or to Road America or Line Rock to examine whatever records they possess, although my impression is records are quite thin. I didn't explore the SCCA archives at the research center, nor did I interview whoever might possess memories of the track's early days. So consider not proven to be tentative, inviting additional research on flows of information and influence at the beginning of post-war road racing. Now we head into the tall grass. We'll explore each of the four development features for each track, with the tracks organized into two pairs, with a weaker pair first. The first pair is Bridgehampton and Long Island. Bridgehampton and Line Rock. You can see that they shared the common experience of a difficult process of coming to be. Bridgehampton was constrained by the, well, you can see for yourself. I won't leave the slides to you. It closed in 1999. Line Rock also shared this long period of struggle in contrast to the Glen and Road America, which are grouped as a stronger pair. The order has gotten scrambled somehow. So now we're going to proceed to examine in greater detail the first feature of the development of these four tracks, which I've called settings, and you'll recall that it's got primarily to do with geography. So now we're going to begin with the first pair of the two of the weaker tracks in the total of four, and we're going to proceed into the tall grass and comparing in some detail. Now I want to say a few summary comments first about Bridgehampton and Line Rock. Bridgehampton first. The Hamptons of eastern Long Island have a long history of whaling, fishing, and agriculture, many years before racing. And by the late 19th century, due in part to the railroad, they were also becoming a site of summer homes for wealthy New Yorkers. They've included artist communities, and in the 70s, the Long Island Expressway made them an urban tourist destination. Topography is mainly flat and gentle rolling land. The track itself was on sandy hills. Racing in the area began more than a century ago as part of the local Firemen's Carnival. And for 5 years, from 1949 the Bridgehampton sports car races took place on local roads. And as to Lime Rock, I need to see. As for Lime Rock, it's a largely rural area. Lakeville is a village in the northwestern Connecticut town of Salisbury in the foothills of the Berkshires. It began as a late 18th century iron industry site, Furnace Village, which was known for cast iron railroad wheels. Owners built grandiose houses in what was a company town. Their families included one man who was a congressman, a senator, and chair of the National Democratic Party. In the 20s, the collapse of the iron industry caused the area to become an artist colony. Norwegian immigrants founded an annual ski jumping competition. Nearby is the historic prep school of Hotchkiss. Easy access to New York City has made Salisbury an enclave of wealthy urbanites. Jalopnik has called Lime Rock the most beautiful track in North America, and it's on the National Register of Historic Places, as are the Glen and Road America. Now, a summary of the second pair before we talk about settings. Watkins is reasonably accessible from a large portion of the Northeast. The loss of Formula One and the bankruptcy tarnished its reputation, leading to a rescue ownership by a local non-racing corporation and then by NASCAR, which to me, neither are obvious owners. But the Glen is a storied track, renowned for originating post-war road racing and hosting the USGP. Road America is fairly close to Chicago and to a few small cities. It became the main Midwestern road racing track, and it's situated in a region of natural beauty with a history of tourism. There has never been local opposition to the track. Originally a project of SCCA members, the track has benefited from a single ownership and being headed for decades by an enlightened founder leader. Now to discuss the setting particularities. Watkins Glen, well, I guess we could just look out the window. Okay, it's an upstate village on the shores of a finger lake with nearby dramatic gorges, in case you didn't know. From the 19th century, it was a tourist attraction, especially to attend the Glen Springs Sanitarium. It was connected to the Erie Canal and later to the railroad. An agricultural area, it now includes vineyards. Seasonal residents have included famous artists. And there's a large Italian-American population. And the Glen is close to Syracuse, Rochester, and Buffalo. Road America is a rural village as well, located in the Kettle Moraine area of northeastern Wisconsin. It has a history of second homes and resort hotels, partly due to its proximity to Milwaukee, 60 miles, and Chicago, 150 miles away, dating especially from the arrival of the railroad in the 1870s. During the 20s, it was known for gambling halls. And after the war, tourism was in decline and local factories closed. The 1950s population of Elkhart Lake was nearly 600. Now, the second feature in the development of all four of these tracks, local promoters. We'll begin again with the first pair, the weaker pair, in my judgment, with Bridgehampton. Bruce Stevenson first observed road racing in 1939 at ARCA's Montauk race. In 1948, he tried to race his MGTC here, but the SCCA rejected his membership application. So the Wall Street businessman determined to race on eastern Long Island, where he had grown up and where he lived. With the support of the local Lions Club, which at the time was headed by a garage owner, he made his proposal to local police and fire chiefs and to the Southampton Town Council. To local authorities, racing's appeal was the usual: image creation and economic benefit. The New York City MG Car Club, represented by John Fitch, and the New York City Motorsports Club of America helped with the organizing, as did the SCCA, which was represented by Alex Ullman and Briggs Cunningham. Gulf Oil supplied gas and oil to the racers, and an antique car show and parade took place before the races. Wine Rock. Jim Valley, who knew nothing about racing, was a farmer who also operated a sand and gravel company, in whose pit his friends would race their MGTC. With an eye to economic development, the village voted in 1955 to strongly support building a track on about 360 acres. And this was after Valley had screened a movie for them about Le Mans. Shortly after construction began, an historic flood washed away all the construction equipment. So $100,000 was raised locally. An area Lotus dealer helped to found the track and raced it. Valley's track design was refined by John Fitch with help from Bill Milligan. Fitch was an early track manager, and he moved to a house across the road from the track, which these days is a B&B run by his daughter, so you can go channel John Fitch. Now the second pair, Watkins Glen. Chief among the local supporters was, of course, Cameron Argetsinger, whose family roots from the mid-19th century were deep. As a young man, he drove Packards fast, and after the war, he dreamt of road racing through the area. Argetsinger gathered a circle of influential men, including a lodge founder-owner who was at the time the Chamber of Commerce president, the garage owner, the village mayor, local newspaper reporter, a salt mine executive, an engineer, and a lawyer, as well as his wife, Jean. Road America now. The most important local figure in the establishment and operation of Road America was Cliff Tufte. He supported the first races, and after the 1953 ban on racing on public roads, Tufte, who was a civil engineer with a sand and gravel company that owned 500 acres of undeveloped land, bought additional farmland and designed and built the track. He was president for nearly 30 years. Jim Kimberly grew up nearby in Mina, a town that houses the headquarters of the paper products manufacturer Kimberly-Clark. His grandfather was one of the founders. As a boy, he raced ice boats on the local lake and later airplanes. An MIT graduate from 1956 to 57, Kimberly served as SCCA president. Following his participation in the 1950 race here, he organized SCCA Chicago members to find a Midwestern site for a similar circuit. For the next few years, he was an active racer, and with his own team, he finished second at Sebring. A local bank president and board chair, who was also, at various times, village treasurer, owner of an insurance agency, a real estate broker, and a 32nd degree Mason, was another participant, as were the fire chief, a golf course owner, and the owner of a well-known resort hotel. A local industrialist, about to be elected governor, and the son of a governor, had a cottage on Elkhart Lake. He was a member of the Kohler Plumbing Supply Company and a graduate of Phillips and Yale. Now, sporting gentlemen, something we talked about last year. In Bridgehampton, Alec Ullman was an ARCA member and later an early SCCA member. He raced sports cars, and he was chief steward here at Bridgehampton. Ullman managed Cunningham's Le Mans team, organized the Sebring 12 Hours in 1952, and ran the first two US GP races in California and Florida. He was born in Russia, multilingual, a pilot, and he held an engineering degree from MIT. Ullman was a successful businessman in the aerospace industry and he owned a home in the Hamptons. Briggs Cunningham's father was a meatpacker, bank president, board member of the Pennsylvania Railroad, and most importantly, an early investor in Procter & Gamble. William Procter was Briggs Jr.'s godfather. Briggs Jr.'s father-in-law had co-founded Standard Oil. So Cunningham lived a life of sailing and racing. Sam Posey says that he epitomized the definition of the American sportsman, capital A, capital S. He was, of course, a key figure in the post-war American road racing, helping to found the SCCA. Cunningham supported establishing racing at Bridgehampton, and his team was often victorious at the track in later years. Bob Greer, who worked in New York City fashion business, was a co-founder of the Motorsports Club of America and was the official photographer at Watkins Glen. His racing career included Sebring with Rene Dreyfuss. Henry Austin Clark Jr. lived in Southampton. He was a graduate of Harvard, and he benefited from investments in the Cuban-American Sugar Company in New York, where his father was an officer. He acquired his first car, a Model T, at age 11. His car collection grew to number 50 and became the basis for the Automotive Museum of Southampton, which was later acquired by Henry Ford. He became vice president of the Bridgehampton track and was a vice president of the Society of Automotive Historians. He was a friend of cartoonist and racer Charles Adams. Now on to Limerock. I apologize for my disconnection between speech and slides. At Limerock, Briggs Cunningham, who brought 2 or 3 trailers to the first race, and other SCCA members encouraged the development of the track. At the end of the first race, Jim Kimberly's nephew, who was also a racer himself, offered to buy the track. Skip Barber first raced there in 1959, and in 1975, he established his driving school there. He and 5 others, with little money of their own, bought the track in 1983. Whose home track it was. Now let's see where are we? At Watkins Glen, racers like Cunningham and the Collier brothers, the local cartoonist Charles Adams, engineer Bill Milliken, and Denver Cornett, about 25 altogether, participated in the first races. Many more raced in 1949 and included Fitch, Dave Garraway, Fred Wacker, and Arcus Zora Duntov, father of the Corvette, whose idea was hatched here in Watkins Glen. Road America, members of the SCCA Chicago region, were the prime movers, such as Fred Wacker, a Hotchkiss graduate and, quote, engineer, prominent socialite, and jazz musician. A street in Chicago's Loop is named for his grandfather, who helped to organize the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. It was Wacker who drove the Ellard that killed 7-year-old Frankie Fazzari during the 1952 street race here, when he was the SCCA president. Leroy Kramer, who served as the Chicago regional executive, had been a member of ARCA, drove with Miles Collier in the 39 Le Mans race, and managed a team at Sebring that included Rene Dreyfuss. An engineer, he graduated from Princeton and Purdue. George Rand was an ARCA organizer, SCCA official, and U.S. delegate to the FIA. When the revival of the Vanderbilt Cup was attempted in 1960, George Rand served as the chief steward. Now, local reception. In Bridgehampton, yes. The summer of 1953 brought together, quote, captains of industry and urbane New Yorkers with local merchants, farmers, and shade tree mechanics to begin planning America's first purpose-built road racing circuit, as one history puts it. The sale of $5 shares in the Bridgehampton Road Races Corporation funded the $55,000 purchase of 600 acres, many of which were small lots. A 2.9-mile track was designed by two engineers from Drummond, which is located nearby, and a local racer. At the beginning, the racing was embraced by local citizens and authorities. The first race alone generated sufficient profit to buy new uniforms for the high school band. But by the 70s, noise complaints multiplied, leading to a 1983 ordinance that restricted racing noise to between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. and capped maximum decibels. These actions and others put racing at such risk that the Bridgehampton Racing Heritage Group was formed in 1981 to protect the track. In 1995, the then majority owner announced his intention to turn the track into a golf course, which it is today. Lime Rock. After the track opened, the Lime Rock Protection Committee, worried about, quote, this intrusion to the village's peaceful life and the threats to its property values, filing numerous lawsuits over the years to shut down the track. Some say these are mainly city people who have moved into the area. Lime Rock's establishment has been described as a troublesome growth. On the other hand, a local woman recalls babysitting racers' children in an old camper bus at the track that was, quote, conducive to families and kids. Locals recognize its contributions to hotels, restaurants, and antique shops. The track has raised funds for area food pantries, offers a 4th of July fireworks show, and lends its facilities to guest speakers from community organizations like the Rotary. Watkins Glen, organizers stirred up a great deal of interest and support, even getting the New York Central Railroad to stop its trains, which crossed the circuit during the road race. People volunteered, merchants enjoyed increased business, residents rented rooms, and the event raised money for local causes, like the hospital. This community spirit persisted at least through the Formula One years. And Road America. The Elkhart Lake Businessmen's Association offered nearly immediate support. In 1954, local people purchased stock in the Road America Corporation. There were dozens of volunteers who came forward for the first race, filling all the positions. A resort owner coordinated advertising. There was no record of opposition. Now, earlier, I promised to slightly modify my not proven conclusion. So here goes. I recently found something in the archives, thanks to JC. Is he here? Where is he?
I'll let you know whether it's right or not.
Talk to my lawyer. That made me consider that a legacy of the Glen might actually reside in the weak understanding of the fact that lessons learned from the Glen's business experience before the several years that led to the bankruptcy could later accelerate the development of road racing and sport tourism. I found correspondence from a 1971 consultancy that offered informed advice to the owners of Road Atlanta just a year after its opening. This two-page, single-spaced letter articulates practical recommendations to a brand new track. But this was decades after the early days of the Glen, and when the other three tracks under discussion had become established entities. So this is not an example of Watkins being a prototype that others tried to imitate in the years immediately following the war. It's something else, less comprehensive and less novel. The advice in this letter was possible because of the writer's role in the first post-war American road race and in later racing that led to making the U.S. Grand Prix historically synonymous with Watkins Glen. The client was a founder of Road Atlanta and chairman of Coca-Cola, which his family helped to found. Arthur Montgomery was a longtime fan of auto racing and fine cars. In the 40s, he had restored a 30s Duesenberg. In the 50s, he drove Jags and Astons. And in the 60s, he began a romance with 17 Ferraris. And he took annual trips to Indy, Daytona, and Sebring. As a businessman, civic leader, car culture enthusiast, and co-founder of Road Atlanta, Montgomery knew where to turn for advice. He turned to Cameron Argetsinger. So, was there a Watkins Glen effect? It looks like we may have to dig deeper in order to fully answer that question. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. That was very interesting, as always. Now, we have, I think, Trevor and Dwayne that have microphones. If anyone in the audience has any questions for Jim, if you could wait till one of these fellows gets to you with a mic. Am I correct on that?
Happy to take challenges. And I do apologize for making a mess of the slides. I'm now retired, so I no longer have undergraduates to exploit making slides. Question? Suggestion? Oh, would you identify yourselves?
Hi, James. Thanks. That's an interesting topic. Thank you. One clarification I wanted to make about Bridgehampton. I grew up on Long Island. That was my home track at one time. I was a member of that heritage group you talk about trying to save the track. Sitting on top of the aquifer was actually an advantage, ironically enough, not a disadvantage. Believe it or not, the environmental groups actually pushed to keep it as a track and not turn it into a golf course because they were concerned that the chemicals from the fertilizer necessary to keep a golf course working would pollute the aquifer. And that aquifer provided all the drinking water to the South Fork, so it was quite important to keep it fresh. So that was actually an advantage. But you are right, the tourism aspect of Bridgehampton, being in, as you put it, a rich playboys neighborhood where they probably didn't care for the serfs to visit them, was not much of an effect at all.
Would you agree that at the beginning it looked like it would have a very promising future?
Yeah, before all the rich people moved in, yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions? All right, Jim, Ben writes, good talk, great to see you again. Do you think there was any particular pre-existing European tracks that had their own effect and influence on American tracks such as Watkins Glen?
Well, that's a big question. I suppose the easy answer is yes. I've heard that as an adult, Cameron traveled frequently to Europe, although that's been framed in my discussions as having more to do with Formula One development and maintenance of that connection. So it's an interesting question, and maybe there were indirect influences. The traditions are very different there and here. Does anyone else have knowledge of European tracks or racing more generally finding their way into American consciousness?
Mark Raffoff, by the way. I know that Cameron was a huge enthusiast of the Nürburgring, and I believe JC probably went to Spa as well. Yeah, and even Monza.
Battle against time
Yep. So there are tracks there that have this kind of legacy, and some people there say it's because the roads they raced on were laid down by the Romans 2,000 years ago, and that's how you got from place to place. Well, here, I know in the beginning and turn of the century, board tracks and oval track racing were built by
That's right.
money from railroads, who then built the rail lines, so people had to ride the railroad to get to the racetrack.
Right.
And the reason for that was we connected our cities even through the Northeast by trains.
Yeah.
We didn't have really good roads to race on, other than in communities like this,
Right.
separate from the urban areas. Just
And some of
my thoughts.
the early oval tracks in the U.S. had been places where horses raced.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
But they also built 2-mile board tracks,
Right.
which when there was a crash and a fire usually burnt the whole place to the ground, which made it was kind of cheap to build another one because it
Right.
wasn't like doing Indy. And of course, Indy was the first one that wasn't made out of wood.
That's right.
So.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, the Nürburgring was a big influencer. Right after the war, there was a German film that came out, was made during the 30s by the Nazi government, glorifying the German cars, the auto unions, and Mercedes-Benz, and there was a lot of footage of the Nürburgring. And my father would play that over and over again in our study, and he would even make members of the staff come in and watch it. We'd watch it all after. My poor aunt had to watch. This is 1946, 47, and we were thrilled with those great cars of the 30s, particularly the Nürburgring. Now, one thing, Jim, we haven't gotten into, and it's interesting about the Chicago region, which was greatly influenced by Watkins Glen. And not to put a bad cast here, but the Chicago region tried to put the stake right through the heart of Watkins Glen. As a matter of fact, they were very vicious about it. Jim Kimberly and Cameron Peck, they threatened Watkins Glen if Watkins Glen did not give up the international racing, that they would abandon and drive Watkins Glen into the ground. And D. Cameron Peck, who was probably one of the richest guys in Illinois, his father owned the biggest dairy, it was said that he could buy and sell Watkins Glen, and if Watkins Glen didn't go along with the sports car club, that it would be all over. And also Fred Wacker, who we mentioned, warned Watkins Glen if they had these top international drivers, there would be a fatality. And the ironic thing is, the next year, D. Cameron Peck was investigated and charged by the IRS for licensing classic cars as milk trucks, and Fred Wacker was the person who did cause the fatality here. And then after that fatality, the SCCA, which was based out of Chicago, dropped Watkins Glen. And so Watkins Glen had to build back from 1953 on without the SCCA, and it was that Chicago group that ran Elkhart Lake that was a great enemy. However, that was all solved in later years, and Watkins Glen and Elkhart Lake became great allies.
Do you think there's evidence hidden away in private files or elsewhere that that would give some credence to the idea that the Glen offered a model that at least some of these other early tracks turned to, maybe exchanges of correspondence where
Yes, there was quite a bit of correspondence, and we'll get into that maybe this weekend between Stevenson and my father. And the Watkins Glen definitely was the inspiration for Bridgehampton. Although there was local strength there, it was a seed that needed to be planted in fertile soil.
Very interesting. And just to return to the political dimension of racing, which Paul will develop later today, my understanding is that Spa was built by the Nazis. Is that right? Spa? Yeah, it's in the Eifel Mountains, and it was, yeah. Oh, that's another subject though, thank you. Yeah, anything else?
Hi, I'm George Webster, and I'm out of Toronto. This idea you have makes me think about the development of the racetracks in Ontario.
Yes.
And growing up in Ontario, and having come here for the first time in '59, I'm aware that in Ontario we were very much aware of the racing here at Watkins Glen, and it was really a part of our racing culture. The development of racetracks in Ontario was somewhat different in that until motorsport was built, it was a series of recommissioned World War II airfields that was used, Harewood being probably the best known of the group. But nevertheless, I'm sure that the organizers, particularly at Harewood, were very, and then the people who went on to build motorsport were very aware of, very aware of Watkins Glen, and looked to that for a lot of examples.
That's helpful to hear. And of course, motorsport hosted the first Canadian Grand Prix in '67, which was part of the, it wasn't independence, what was the term? Confederation, I think. Yeah. That was my first Grand Prix race. That and Expo '67 in one trip. So that international dimension is very helpful to think about. Thank you.
You should look at the talk that I gave about the 50 years of the Canadian Grand Prix, which is on YouTube.
Oh, that's great. We should talk too. Yeah. I think Bill had his hand up.
Are you aware at Elkhart Lake they ran 3 years on public roads?
But where?
Public roads on Elkhart Lake. They ran.
Yes.
They ran
Yes.
first almost into Elkhart.
Yeah.
And the finish line was in the driver's or a farmer's front yard on that, and then they ran around the circuit. The circuit ran around the lake.
Yeah. I think it was '53 when the state of Wisconsin banned racing on public roads.
What?
That racing on public roads was banned
Where?
at Elkhart in '53, the state of Wisconsin.
No, they were. The governor was in favor of having the races run around the lake or on the public roads if they didn't have an accident. They did in '52, because in one race, one car spun off and one person was injured. And he turned around and said, "You better forget it now." And they did, 2 years. Also, there was another man that disliked the races, and so the sheriff assigned a deputy to him to take him fishing that weekend. So they didn't, and that's written down in a magazine. So, but anyways, and also while I'm on the mic here, I want to make it straight that, you know, in New York State, under Article 1182, it says you can still have races on public roads if you have the following things: permit, adequate insurance, and protection for spectators. That's why the state wouldn't give them the permit for 1953, because there was, you couldn't get insurance either. But also, I'll back up to the fact in the state assembly, the legislature, in the Senate, in the spring of 1953, they had a bill in there to ban racing on public roads. It had 3 no votes. In the assembly, our assemblyman, Jerry Black, tied that bill up in committee, and it was never a law. Thus, you still can have racing on public roads if you have adequate insurance and a permit. They never applied for the permit, but they went to the town, and the second course was on town-maintained roads for 3 years.
Right.
Town of Dix, there.
Thank you, Bill.
Any other questions?
Yeah, J.J. O'Malley.
Hi, JJ.
How you doing? If it wasn't for Cameron Argetsinger and what he did, would the top of your talk be the Sebring effect, which would be racing resurrected after World War II on military bases, old airports, Sebring, Laguna? I mean, Cameron took the step, and the other thing you mentioned, Joel Finn's wonderful book about the ARCA.
Yes.
And I think Cameron had kind of that as a model, but he used the downtown Watkins Glen. And the fact that that race was, and the following years, was so successful, not only competitive-wise, but spectator turnout, interest in the New York City media, I think
Yes.
that really generated the Watkins Glen effect.
Yeah.
So do you
So,
And see, Cameron's initial action is causing the effect which led to interest at Bridgehampton, Elkhart Lake.
well, clearly when there's an historical moment, actual people do things. And we look back and assign them, crucial agency in determining the beginning of something in this case. So who could deny that he was, the key dude locally, which then kind of snowballed. But I still think that if you zoom back further, there were all kinds of other things happening in American society that made this sort of thing logical. And it, therefore, a very similar, even identical, series of developments took place with other people being the kingpins in other places. So, as I tried to say, there's none of the Scotch verdict doesn't diminish his significance or even the Glenn's, because after all, they were the first. But to my mind, in historical terms, these things were nearly simultaneous developments. So I also sort of feel that we have to be aware of the great man theory of history, where the kind of history we learned in high school. This person did this and this person did that. Well, what about, the rest of the world, population? Anyway, not to go on, but I think I want to have it both ways. Is that okay? All right. By the way, your work, I salute. Thank you.
So I just want to add that the tracks that were just discussed today, worldwide, are considered the places that people from Europe and Asia want to come and race. They are all, except for Watkins Glen's one revision, exactly, except for a couple of chicanes because the cars are getting too fast situations, the way they were designed. And today, when the Europeans come to race, yeah, Sebring and Daytona are important, but Watkins Glen, Road America, Lime Rock, and Road Atlanta are termed consequential racetracks. It's not like a Formula One track where you can go sailing off the road at 180 and never hit anything. So as a driver, the challenge to them today, because of that Watkins Glen effect, is still there. And those tracks have never changed, and they're just the places people want to race now from all over the world. Those four, and I'll add motorsport as well, which may be the most consequential racetrack in North America these days, is actually a faster average speed for our cars than Daytona is.
Well, that's really, really helpful.
Well, IMSA goes, but we had to take the big cars out because the guys driving it went, this is getting pretty sketchy because it was so fast. Yeah, it's a great racetrack.
Just to add to the Lime Rock story, the original, it's a quite short track, a mile and a half, but the original plan was to double that into what they call now the mountain track. Yes, so it was an elevation change of 300 feet and would have been, in my view, much more interesting. But I think it was mainly money. In fact, I believe they had cut down the trees in preparation, but it didn't expand. I mean, it's had such a tortured life. But that's the track. It's fairly near where I live, and so I've watched its improvement in recent years, and so they're really on a good track right now, so to speak.
Also very fast.
Yes, it is. A friend of mine was last in the vintage race last fall. So. Okay, other questions?
Did earlier events like the Vanderbilt Cup races have any influence on the Watkins Glen effect, or were they just lost to history?
Well, there's evidence that young Cameron Argetsinger in Youngstown, Ohio, was excited by those races. And at that point, they may have been more of a memory. I don't recall whether they were still going on in the 30s. The heyday was earlier. But I think he, as a young man, was quite excited by that. Is that fair to say, JC?
That's correct, and also the 37 and 38 revision of the Vanderbilt, he remembered that as a young guy. He was 16 and 17, and that really excited him.
And interesting to me as a media person is that he didn't go to those races, so he could only have known them through printed media, probably, and they tended to come quite late. I mean, those of us who grew up in the 50s and 60s were reading car magazine reports of Formula One races that had taken place a month or two earlier, right? So he had this delayed media filtered knowledge which is, in some ways, I think, can be more intense, thrilling to a young person than actually going. So. Anything
Anyone
more?
else have any questions, comments? Great talk
Great.
and excellent questions and commentary. And,
Yes,
you know,
thank-
we have got a lot of historians here, but I just want to say from my money, I'm going to put my money on that green guy that spoke earlier in the corner. Jim, thank you very much. Another
Thank
very
you
enjoyable-
very much.